Good morning, everybody. James Satterley here. I want to do what I believe is the first video review on the book Scottish Fencing, five 18th century texts on the use of the small sword, broadsword, Spadroom, Cavalry Sword, and Highland Battlefield Tactics. Presented by Maestro Kirby, introductions and historical essays by Maestro MacDonald and Ben Miller. I've been aware of Jared Kirby for quite some time. I'm friends with Paul MacDonald on Facebook. He's probably the only one of these guys that's even aware of my existence. I've been kind of one of those shadowy figures in the HEMA community, I guess, if you will. Mainly I've been in the Renaissance community, so I do living history. That's where I do my swordplay for the most part. But I've been doing HEMA for quite some time. I've been doing Highland Broadsword since 2005. So my original book that I studied, it's Highland Broadsword by Paul Wagner and Mark Rector. That was kind of my Bible of Highland Broadsword for a long time. And as you can see in my back wall, I've got, different versions of the Henry Angelo's material, which is also published in Highland Broadsword. So, coming from that background and being more of a broadsword guy, I don't train with small sword. I don't even own a set of foils. I will admit that. I do occasionally thumb through the small sword material, but I'm not really a big small sword guy. And I wouldn't mind getting into small sword at some point. But nevertheless, so I'm going to give a review on this book. And what I like about this book, other than the fact that it's a hardcover and it has 5 Scottish primary sources on swordsmanship, and also it's got, this is kind of cool, it's got some of Angelo's broadsword guard material, which you can only get in the hardcover edition. So I recommend that if you're interested in Scottish fencing, get this book, but get the hardcover version. It really is, it's nicer, you get this on the back of it. Hardcovers are more durable anyways. So the first thing is an anonymous manuscript on examination and vindication of the Highlanders, and it's basically a book talking about, or a previously unpublished manuscript talking about the how the Highlanders fought. It was probably written around 1743 or before. It's basically it's written before the 1745 Jacobite uprising. So it's interesting. It's the only problem with it for me is that the paragraphs are super long, but that was done to be in keeping with the original text. What I might do at some point for my own purposes is retranscribe all of it, break into paragraphs that are easier to read, and maybe at some point make that available as a study guide. Even if only for myself and my immediate, sword partners and whatnot. But it's an interesting book, and the guy obviously is very pro-Highlander when it comes to how they fought, and in regards to the honor and the courage that the Highlanders had. Sorry, I can't speak this morning. The next book that is covered here is, it's actually The Swordsman by John Ferdinand, which I think is actually a really interesting text. A Mr. Angelo and also a John Taylor happen to be subscribers to his book, which would explain a few things. If it's the same John Taylor from the Light Horse Volunteers of London and Westminster, and if Mr. Angelo is either John Xavier Angelo, the uncle of Henry Angelo, or if it was Domenico Angelo, the father of Henry Angelo, it would explain how broadsword material got its way into Angelo's hands, other than the fact that he trained with a James Parry of Scotland on top of a prison in London. But that's a different story. We don't know how Angelo actually learned his broadsword material, but this seems to be maybe one of the sources for that. As a brief overview on it, other than the small sword and the Spadroom sections, representing respectfully sections 1 and 3, section 2 covers the broadsword material. And what is cool about that is that what I can tell, just being as experienced as I am with the different previously published primary sources on Highland Broadsword, it's, you know, the lessons, or the assaults as he calls them, there's 12 of them for the broadsword. It basically, it seems as if he's using, there's material that is reminiscent of later Angelo material. Like, you know, a cut at the leg, doing St. George Guard, and then cutting at the outside of the leg. So, you know, I'll do a more in-depth review of this later, I think. But it's interesting because you can see where Angelo may have got some material, or his Scottish principles, as he mentions, again, in this version of his 1799 chart on the use of, on the 10 lessons. So the way it's presented is kind of in a similar way that Sinclair presents his lessons, which is that each lesson is like a technique for the most part, or a set of like 2 or 3 moves at the most. Whereas Angelo, in his, he goes anywhere between 4 to 12 movements within his lessons. The way that John Ferdinand does it is a little more like Sinclair and others who are previous to Angelo. I like Angelo. I like the way he does it. However, I could also see some of the points that John Ferdinand makes, and I think it's a very useful text. But again, it seems to be along the vein of Sinclair, or the anonymous Highland officer of anti-pugilism, but you can see where Angelo gets some material as well, which is pretty cool. The next is actually a dictionary by Harry Ferguson. It's basically a dictionary, but it also does have a dictionary explaining the terms used in fencing. And it's interesting. His, I mean, he'll have like a whole paragraph, you know, as a definition for something, which is nice. It's not what you'd really call an actual manual, kind of like in the same sense that Archibald MacGregor's lecture on the art of defense is not really a manual. It's a lecture that got written down and published, but it's still useful. The next one is a book by Sholto Douglas Sorley, which is basically it heavily borrows from Le Marchant's broadsword cutlass manual that is used for British Army. So, Treatise on the New Sword Exercise for Cavalry by Sholto Sorley. And, you know, if you're looking for later saber work of that time that is heavily borrowed from Marchant, this is useful in that respect. You know, I'm not a big fan of Marchant's book. Not because it isn't relevant; it's totally relevant to the history of broadsword, as even I practice it. But the artwork is one of the problematic things for me. But yeah, I also don't fight on horseback. When I do my sparring, it's all on foot. So yeah, that's why John Taylor, or rather the Taylor version of the Roworth text, the 1804 edition, is one of the most useful texts I use for training in broadsword. Anyways, but nevertheless, as a Scottish manual, or a manual published by a Scotsman, it is relevant for historical purposes. The last section here is Donald McAlpine. It's not really a manual, but it does actually contain a lot of primary source information, photos, history, letters, and he's a very important figure in colonial American history. As a Highland Regiment officer, he and this whole section, I believe, heavily relies on J. Christoph Amberger's. He made a couple of different articles on the subject of British broadsword and backsword, and mentions and American swordsmanship. That and he mentions this. So that's where a lot of this information, I think, is derived from, to an extent, at least why it was put together. But there's actual more solid primary source data in this section. It's a great book. You know, I recommend it if you're a HEMA person like me, if you love Highland broadsword, and if you love just swordsmanship in general. If you're a small sword person, you'll get use out of it, or if you're a Spadroonist, if that's even a word. So yes, anyways, I'll do a more in-depth review of other portions later, but I hope you found this useful. Definitely buy it, and I'll talk to you guys later.